wondering if you could tell a little about the straight edge punk scene and your experience of it.
Sure. So straight edge, for those of you who don't know, is a sort of subculture of a subculture, as Roger said, that grew out of Washington, D.C. in the early 80s. This book takes place in 1988 for the most part, except for the scene. And it basically grew out of this sort of just say no ethos of the 80s. So it's, on one hand, you have these teenage boys, for the most part, who are saying no to drugs and sometimes sex and meat, the pretty militant, righteous choir boy lifestyle on the one hand, which some parents were very happy about. But then on the other hand, they're going to clubs like 930 Club and CBGB and getting into fights and listening to very aggressive hardcore punk music. So that paradox really intrigued me. And I came at the straight edge scene from a kind of secondary perspective. So I wasn't directly involved in it, but when I met my husband, he was. And, I thought he was super cool. He was older and had like really good taste in music and, had really adorable tattoos. So I was really drawn to the scene, you could say. But I never really felt like I belonged in it. And so I think I always kind of had a like journalistic perspective. And then I kind of came at it like wanting to write an ethnography of straight edge. So, I mean, I think, certainly this book would have been different if I had been an insider. But I think ultimately it became a project of mine to want to try to provide many different perspectives on this really rich, interesting scene. It seemed to be a culture in which there were many stories, and so it became my mission to try to discover them.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a similar question since, I haven't read your novels out of ignorance, but I was in some of those bad brain shits, and so this sort of more relates to what you said in Ron's introduction, but I was wondering, like, whether you, since you just described yourself as an anthropologist, whether you saw that scene as being something that related to being lost or being depressed or something like that, or if that was kind of a literary conceit, just because, I don't know, I had a lot of different experiences with those people. But,
well, maybe you can share your own story, but I went to a number of shows, with my husband in Vermont in the late 90s, and so, I wasn't entirely an outsider in the sense that I, experienced the energy of some of those scenes. And, I grew up listening to, grunge rock in the mid-90s in high school. And so I had a very different experience of what it's like to be at a rock show. I would go to these, like, palatial auditoriums to go see Stone Temple Pilots or something where I'm like, this is why I wanted you guys so close to me. Because, you feel like you're 20 miles away from the singer on the stage. And so I felt lost and isolated, and I felt like I had no connection to the music that I loved. And so when I went to these shows where you have this many people who are a family, and they're throwing each other around the room, and, there's this, like, cosmic connection, I felt like I wanted in. And so I think that's that envy that I had toward the community of the punk scene really fueled my writing, although I didn't really realize that until later. So, I think people were drawn and are drawn to straight edge for lots of different reasons. I think some of them are lost and depressed. I think some of them are looking for a family, and, as many teenagers do, sort of looking for a place to belong, looking for an excuse not to drink, when they're, like, not cool enough to drink anyway, right? Like, that was sort of me. I was kind of, like, straight edge in high school, but just not cool enough to call myself straight edge. I was just a square. So there are those kinds of kids, and then there are kids who, like many of the characters in the book, really had rough childhood, and experimented with drugs a little bit too hard, and then ended up really turning over a new leaf in order to save their own lives. So, that was one of my aims in trying to create enough characters in this world who really came to this path from different origins. That was one of the things I wanted to do. Yeah, April.
So I'm asking this question for myself, and also because I have a student who's here, and we were just talking about revisions in class today. They're working on 8 to 10 page short stories, and basically 2 substantive revisions over a month and a half. So So you took, you mentioned taking 9 months, sorry, 9 years.
Yeah.
That was a trimester thing.
I was just wondering if you'd be willing to talk a bit about what else you did during that 9-year process.
Right. Well, I should say that I wasn't working on this novel every day. It spent a lot of time in a drawer. I wrote most of the first draft in grad school at UVA, so I kind of had like a support system intact, which was really useful for me because I was sort of petrified of writing a novel. And then once I'd written this book, I had like 550 pages. It was much longer, and it was just an utter wreck. It was a mess. But I had to write those 550 pages in order to discover the much tighter, more coherent story that I wanted to write. So I've never really been scared of revision. I've always seen it as an opportunity to clarify the world that I'm getting closer and closer to. It doesn't mean I don't dread it. I mean, it's like housework. No one really looks forward to doing the laundry, but you feel better once you've done it, right? You've got a cleaner house. It's spick and span. So I try to remind myself, when I'm dreading revision, that it is an opportunity. And, it's in some ways it's easier when you have a month and a half to do it and you have the deadline. But I think if someone had given me a deadline, I would have been grateful because obviously I needed one. But at the same time, I think that there's something to be said for, Janet Burroway has this phrase in writing fiction, which I teach from, worrying it and walking away. So I worried it and I walked away for a long time. And I think especially because this was my first book, it was important for me to walk away for a while because I was still growing as a person, teacher, writer. I hope I still am. But especially during those years, I began the book when I was not that far from Jude's age, and then finished it when I was closer to the parents' age, and really identified more with the parents by the end of the book. So even though the book was in a drawer for a long time, I feel as though it was kind of fermenting a little bit, and I could go back to it with truly fresh eyes, right? That's the whole idea of revision. Yeah.
Was music a really big influencing factor in the book? Because I noticed early when you said that one of your characters' name is Jude, I was hoping that it was after Hey Jude, because I'm such a huge Beatles fan, and then when I heard
it's a very good reading, gold star for you. Yeah, yes, yeah. And Jude is named after Hey Jude, and his sister Prudence is named after Prudence. And so the song, there's some patterns at the lyrics that come back. At one point, I think one of the parts of the book was called "Sad Song." And Prudence was someone else originally, and then she became Prudence because she's so prudent, she just earned her name over the course of the book. And her mother sort of laments that she named her such a perfect name because even though the mother loves having such a responsible little girl, she also is sort of frustrated by how perfect she is. And even though she's frustrated that her son is a drug addict and depressed in bed, she also sort of identifies with him. She's a glass blower and something of a IAB still. So the music was, also, in addition to being just something fun to write about, because I'm also a Beatles fan, the music was a way for me to bridge the generations. So as I began to write the book, one of the things that I discovered was that I was interested not just in this generation, not just in this coming of age, but in a relationship between these kids who came of age in the 80s and their parents who came of age in this sort of flower child generation. And the music both unites them and divides them. So there are things that unite this boy and his mother, for example, and also things that keep them apart. And that was interesting to me to explore through the music. I'm more of a Hey Jude fan than a Bad Brains fan. Actually, I love Bad Brains, but it's easier to write a novel to Hey Jude than Bad Brains. So I had a lot more Beatles on my stereo when I was working on this for 9 years than Bad Brains. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. It was lovely to meet you.